Welcome back to the Personal Finance Project. We are doing another installment of Book Club today, where we are going to continue in the series that we've been doing with Christine Benz's book, How to Retire, which I think is applicable to many of the listeners here. And this is actually chapter number 14 with Jamie Hopkins. And the subheading of this chapter is Be Adaptable as Retirement Unfolds. So I think just to kind of set the stage for what it is that Jamie and Christine talk about in this chapter, I could just read kind of her opening, which she does a really good job of giving you a good idea of the content. So Christine says, trying to hit a moving target in the wind. That's retirement planning expert Jamie Hopkins' metaphor for why retirement planning is so hard. So much could change, will change. You don't know how long you'll live or how your investments will perform. You don't know how your goals and interests might evolve. You don't even know how you'll feel about being retired. That's why Jamie thinks being adaptable is so important in retirement. If you come into retirement thinking you have a settled retirement plan that you'll stick to for the next 25 years or more, you're going to be sorely disappointed. When you see that plan upended, or you're going to be disappointed when you see that plan upended. If you come into retirement knowing that you're going to have to adjust as you go, those adjustments will stress you out much less. Jamie and I discussed some of the key adaptations that retirees will have to make as the years unfold and how they should approach them. So the whole kind of basis of this conversation was being very flexible, being adaptable to how your retirement is going to unfold across time. And as they alluded to here, it isn't just the movement of the markets, because I think when a lot of people hear about trying to be flexible, their mind immediately goes to, well, that probably means the size of my investment portfolio, how much income I can safely withdraw from that portfolio on a year-to-year basis. That's really what they're talking about in terms of being flexible. And they do get into that because that is an important element of it. But he certainly goes beyond that and says you actually need to be flexible in terms of who it is that you actually think you are, what kind of the things you're actually going to want to do when you're retired, where you might want to live, with whom you might want to spend your time, and what it'll actually mean to live out a successful retirement. I think Jamie does a good job of kind of digging into those details. So let's jump in. Again, this is sort of an interview style book, which makes this conversation really easy. So Christine's first question was, why do you think that being adaptable is so important to success in retirement? Excuse me. And Jamie says, there are a lot of things that you're going to take for granted as true for retirement that won't play out to be true. But life is about to change, and is about change and our ability to move. That's why trees are strong. They flex in the wind. And one of the notes that I made to myself here was, and this has proven to be such a salient bit of advice from Mo, is that retirees really need to understand that their whole paradigm is going to shift. It's not so much as just you are working for a corporation you've worked for your entire life on one day and you're retired the next day, though that's how it's somewhat operationalized, or that's how you actually live out your retirement. There is a final day of work, but Jamie's going to get into how that doesn't necessarily need to be the case here. But that was the note that I made about you're going to have to adapt to your new circumstances, and those new circumstances are going to be very different from the circumstances that you've probably just retired from. So Mo's point was you need to make sure that you're retiring to something, and if you're not retiring to something, then it probably isn't worth retiring just yet. But Christine goes on, and she says, Jamie, you're a big believer in a gradual transition to retirement, which seems like it might allow you to get comfortable with a lot of aspects of being a retired person. And Jamie says, there's a lot of value in phased retirement. We don't have enough formal phased retirement programs in the United States, but like most things in life, we're better off if we get a test drive, if we get to experience something before we go fully into it. And the note that I made here to link back to a conversation that Scott and I had regarding some mistakes that people make in their 20s and 30s was a lot of times people who endeavor upon a career not having done the work of figuring out what it is to actually have that career. And so the note I made was surrogates. So I think a really easy way for a retiree to get a sense of what it might actually be like to be retired isn't necessarily to have observed their parents, because that could be, there could be such a generational divide there, and retirement funding and just what it means to be retired has evolved so much since probably retirees today's parents retired, so baby boomers' parents retired, that I'm not sure that those are going to be accurate surrogates for what your retirement is going to be like. Instead, if you work at a major corporation, and many people who are retiring do, you might want to find somebody within the corporation that retired 5 or 10 years ago and ask them how it's going. If their retirement is going the way they thought it might go, how they feel about their money and having all of their assets from which they need to take their income exposed to market risk, or a good chunk of them, those sorts of questions and actually getting a first-person take on what it means to be retired will prevent you from thinking that you can dance casually through this minefield of pitfalls and just live the retirement you thought you were going to live, having no real firsthand information about it. And so that was, I think, a very good piece of advice, was not necessarily just test running it or dry running it for yourself, but maybe actually learn from the mistakes that other people who have come before you made and organize your life such that you don't make those same mistakes. And so Jamie says, start with a question. What does retirement mean to me? And that sounds like a kind of hokey question for, I think, most people. It's one of those woo-woo questions. It's like, what does it mean to be successful? Or, what is happiness like? Or what do women want? Nobody knows. You know what I'm saying? So, but I think that it's really true. And there was this other book written by Ernie Zelinsky, heck of a name. And in this book, which is a wonderful book, it's got a hokey title actually called How to Retire Happy, Wild, and Free. So a lot of hokey on today's podcast, but I think it's worthwhile. And Ernie says to aim for the ideal retirement lifestyle requires that you know what you want out of retirement. Let there be no doubt about the importance of being focused. Few people give any thought to what they are doing and why they are doing it. It's all too easy to get lost in frivolous pursuits, people, and various other distractions. Only by concentrating on the things that matter can you make your retirement dreams come true. So again, kind of hokey, but one of the things that Jamie is really going to repeat here is you need to have some sense of an idea of how you're actually going to be spending your time when you are retired. And so Christine actually says, one thing that has come through loud and clear in a lot of the conversations for this book, and you will see a sort of an underlying theme here, is that even if you're not doing paid work anymore, you still need a purpose. You need a reason to get up in the morning. And there's a quote from a clinical psychologist on that, and it will kind of tie into what Jamie says here. It says, we always talk about how retirees on average are happier than the general population. And that's true. But there are actually more people in retirement who are depressed than is the case for the general population as well. And so I found this quote from a clinical psychologist who would treat patients, and he said, lacking the fundamental components of a meaningful existence, and these would be things like a purpose, meaningful relationships, an identity, an aim, something that you are engaged in that you feel like is worth doing, is actually more serious in his view than clinical depression. It's an existential void that requires reconstruction. So I think that this is particularly true for men, where their entire identity could be wrapped up in the work that they're doing and the relationships that they have at work and where they find themselves in their hierarchy at work, especially if they've worked themselves up to, and this is true for a lot of people who are retiring, right there at the end of your career, you're probably a person of esteem. Whether or not that's recognized in your title, but certainly in the wisdom that you've accumulated over the course of your career, you're probably a person to whom younger individuals or coworkers will go to in order to get advice. And now when you leave that setting and you're kind of cast adrift into a retirement, if you don't have anything concrete on which to land or anything that's tangible to hang on to as you make this transition in life, Jamie's point is you can find yourself drifting purposelessly through your life. And as Ernie just pointed out there, it's really easy then to get distracted by frivolous pursuits or really just relationships that are not fulfilling whatsoever. So having a purpose, having a real idea of the sort of individual you want to be when you have to separate your identity from the work that you've been doing in those work-related relationships is extremely important. So, and then another thing that he mentioned was a lot of people go into retirement and they lose their connection point, their community, their meaning. Life is going to be different in retirement, and that can be so challenging for some people that they enter into a depression. And there's this book written by Dick Couch that covers a group of Navy SEALs as they go through BUDS. And so phase 1 in BUDS, or Basic Underwater Demolition School, peaks at what's called Hell Week. And that's kind of like the crucible for anybody who wants to be a Navy SEAL. You can look this up. This is a really, really, really sort of ridiculous week. A week, I think, is like 168 hours. They allow them to have basically 4 or 5 hours of sleep through this course of the whole week. They're doing all sorts of crazy stuff. But what's really interesting is the rates of depression among SEALs who have made it successfully through Hell Week spike in those weeks following, because there's this huge mountain that they want to climb and they get over it. And then they get to the other side and they realize like, oh, it was the pursuit of the thing that I was really excited about, not necessarily the thing itself. And so now that they are beyond Hell Week and that's behind them, They're no longer so engaged in trying to get through this very difficult thing. And certainly phase 2 and phase 3 of buds, they're very difficult in their own right. But now that they've sort of eclipsed that, or that they've topped that mountain, so to speak, they don't have that same challenge to look forward to. And I think Jamie's point here is retirement can sort of be that way, where there's this vague notion of, oh, yes, you're going to have all of this free time. You're going to be able to pursue the things that you want to pursue, and you're not going to be answerable to anybody. But then you actually get there. And if you don't have something to fill your time with, you find yourself sort of drifting and perhaps sliding into a depression, as he points out here. And so one of the funnier quips he had is, a lot of times when I have those conversations with people, these are conversations about retirement, they say, I want to travel and see my kids, or I want to play golf, or I want to go fishing. And he says, my response is, you've just described 3 out of 365 days. The other 362 days appear to be empty. Forcing someone to go through what a week looks like is a really helpful exercise. Some people have a clear view, but those who don't should write out what their ideal week would be. And I think people do crave rhythm. So whether you like it or not, your life is going to fall into somewhat of a natural cadence. And I think Jamie's point is that can be a cadence that's happening just by chance, or a cadence that's happening by choice. And his point would be, you don't have to detail out every single minute of every single day. I think that would be absurd, because it would be so subject to change that it wouldn't be a worthy endeavor. But I think his point is, you want to have some weekly structure. When are you going to go to the gym? When are you going to see your family? When are you going to take your wife out on a date? When are you going to do all these sorts of things that you want to do in your retirement? But make sure that you're not just leaving those items up to chance, because if you just wait for these things to happen organically, you might be waiting a long time, or your retirement might be unfolding in a way that you never envisioned it would be unfolding. All right. So that's sort of their adaptability on the identity piece. And then they move into the paradigmatic shift of saving to spending, which can be very difficult for some people. So Christine asks this question pretty much straight up. She says, one big and often difficult transition for a lot of retirees is moving away from receiving a paycheck and into spending down their own resources. Why is that transition so hard? And Jamie says, when it comes to retirement, we really only learn about saving. And that's definitely true. Everybody has a sense, and Scott and I joke all the time, if you woke a financial advisor in the middle of the night and said, should I be maxing out my 401k? First, we would say, get the hell out of my house. But then we would say, yeah, that strikes me as a pretty good idea. But when it comes to sustainable withdrawal rates, or when it comes to actually spending down your accumulated assets, there's not such a widely agreed upon set of precepts that most financial advisors would just immediately say, yeah, that strikes me as a good idea. You have some of these general rules of thumb or heuristics to which people can, I think, unfortunately, they can anchor through them too heavily. The 4% rule immediately comes to mind. So it's just take whatever you have in your portfolio, divide that by 25 and start there. There are worse things that you could do. But again, a lot of people will adopt that as if they've tattooed this 4% withdrawal on their portfolio and they can never do anything different. And I think Jamie's point that he's going to make here is that's not necessarily the case. So we learn a lot about saving. We learn about putting money away and seeing the account balance grow. And we've learned that that is good and that spending is bad. The fundamental message from financial planning is to save more money than you spend. And we are told that for 40 years. Explains why people have a very difficult time spending. And then he says, then you get into retirement and we pull the rug out from underneath you and we say, just kidding, you need to know how to spend and not save. Watching your account go down each month might actually be a good thing, but that's really hard to adjust to. We see this behavior when people go to retirement and they just like to spend the interest and not the principal. Many people don't spend enough in retirement because they've been conditioned for 40 years not to spend down their portfolio. And this is a question that we got into when we talked about the book Bill Perkins wrote, where you have to change, and as Mo would say, your paradigm has to shift with regards to how you view your investment portfolio. You can no longer view it as just an investment portfolio. Certainly pieces of it when you enter retirement are still going to be necessary to fund the later stages of your retirement, and that portion of your portfolio could very well be regarded as an investment portfolio. But a big chunk of the portfolio that you've accumulated when you enter retirement is for you to enjoy. It is so that you can have the experiences that you want to have between now and when you get to the end of your life. And I think that Jamie's point is it's very difficult for people to make that switch where they are paralyzed by ever dipping into the principal value of their portfolio because They think, well, if I spend down the goose, so to speak, it won't lay as many golden eggs. And then I'll have fewer and fewer golden eggs to spend safely. And people cry out for discipline. Like my children, they want structure. If you want to have a horrible day, just tell your kids they can do whatever they want. They do not like that very much. And I think the same is true for retirees. And so in order to get that structure, they'll construct these rules that they are going to try to obey, but that they don't necessarily need to obey. And so one of the common strategies people used to do when they entered retirement was, I've accumulated $2 or $3 or $4 million or whatever it was. Interest rates were such, particularly in the past, were high enough such that they could say, well, I'll just load this up into kind of like William Bernstein said, a tips ladder or something that's going to throw off income, and I'll just spend the income, but I definitely won't ever touch that principal because that's for somebody else to enjoy, not realizing that somebody else probably doesn't care near as much about that portfolio as they do. And so I think that that's a really great point that he makes. The other thing that he says is in retirement, we don't have the same sort of systematic protections that we have on the savings side, like automatic enrollment or automatic savings, or even investment options that are a little bit more automatic, something like a target date fund. He even says Social Security doesn't turn on automatically. If you don't claim by 70, you're just out that money. And I think that's an important point for those of you who are in retirement. You do have to proactively claim your Social Security. They will not just start sending you the checks. In fact, they'd be delighted if you just forgot to claim your Social Security. So make sure that you do that after having a discussion about when. And he even says we have a lot of 75-year-olds out there who have just never received any benefits. So most of the steps that you need to take with your money in retirement, rollovers, required minimum distributions, Social Security claiming, all of those things require action. And then the other note that I made to myself on that front is they often require proactive steps be taken by you, the individual, often unguided by anybody. There's not going to be somebody from the Social Security office who's going to show up at your house and walk you through a Social Security analysis in order to optimize your benefits. They're not going to provide that to you. Now, the Social Security website is helpful. It will give you an estimate of your benefits if you claimed at various ages, but they're never going to sit down with you and talk through all the various claiming strategies. And then the other part of that is many of these decisions are irrevocable and irreversible, which means you don't get to test run what it's like to initiate a rollover out of your 401k plan and into an IRA most times, especially if there are interesting provisions within your plan like net unrealized appreciation. And so it's not only that you have to make these decisions proactively because they're not going to be made automatically on your behalf. You can't set it and forget it, so to speak. These are decisions that are going to have near-term costs and benefits and then long-term costs and benefits. And that's why, obviously, my bias is clear. Working with somebody who has done this many, many times with people similarly situated to you, the listener, is extremely invaluable. Even if you don't end up working long-term with an advisor, having somebody help you navigate the transition between employment and post-employment or employment and retirement, pension funding, Social Security optimization, all of those decisions need to be made. They have to be made proactively, and they are often irrevocable. So that's a really important element in retirement. And it's why being retired is often so much more difficult than it is to be where I am in my career, where the vast majority of my saving is done where I never see the money. And Scott and I have talked about how that's a huge benefit in the 401k plan because that's a decision that solves for 1,000 decisions. If you set aside some money every week or every month or every 2 weeks, however it is that you get paid from your paycheck, it's best if you never see it. And that way you can just never really consider it as part of your budget. That doesn't happen at retirement. It's not like you can just set up an automatic distribution. You can, but it's not going to optimize it for you. It's not going to say, oh, this month we're going to take it out of your traditional IRA and next month your Roth IRA and then next year your HSA, and for this, we're going to actually go ahead and take it out of your taxable brokerage account. None of that is happening automatically. And so Jamie says that makes these decisions in retirement that much more difficult than decisions that you made, say, before you were retired. Okay. Christine goes on. She says, you mentioned the psychological dimension of switching to spending from being a saver. I've noticed that frugality is part of some people's identity. They might say, I'm a saving person. I will put off spending on myself. It seems like it can be a badge of honor. Have you encountered that? And the note I made to myself is we often lionize people who are hyper cost conscious. So these sorts of people who have run a very tight budget, or no one's ever been there's no manager, middle manager at a corporation who's ever been given a raise based on finding ways for them to spend more money. Like that's never happened. And we see like controlling labor costs is just another way of hiding mass layoffs. So when you see that sort of language, we're saying, oh, this company has a very conservative balance sheet, means they don't spend a lot of money. And we often will hold these people in high esteem as people who can continue to defer the gratification of spending money. And while that is certainly helpful, it's a great skill set to have. And people have, raised some questions about the validity of the marshmallow test and there's certainly valid reasons to consider whether or not that's true. However, people who can delay gratification often do better with things like saving for retirement. But as they're going to dive into here is like, if you've been known as being a super frugal, cost-conscious person, you might not be setting yourself up for the easiest transition into the period of your life where spending is really the only thing you're going to be doing because you're no longer earning an income. And so Jamie says, people view being frugal as a gift, like a spiritual gift, as a badge of honor. Me being irritated is my spiritual gift. This makes sense when you're saving, but when the dial changes and retirement occurs, we need to know not just how to cut back on expenses, but we need to learn how to spend. This is where behavior modification happens. We do something for a long period of time and it becomes a habit. Then it becomes our identity, and it's really hard to stop doing it, whether it's good for you or not. Just like that, saving and not spending becomes part of people's identities and their behaviors. It's hard to break. Just because you don't go into an office anymore does not change how you save and spend money. And that's the whole point. He's saying just because you are now under the banner of retired person doesn't mean all of these other dimensions of your identity are going to shift like that. It's not like you're going to be a person who is extremely cost conscious and now you've been retired for 3 days and you're out there, giving 30, 40, 50% tips. Like, it's probably not going to happen. And you're probably going to have to work at it a little bit. And as Jamie alluded to earlier, maybe you give yourself a little bit of a retirement dry run ahead of when you actually initiate your formal retirement, just to get a sense of what it might be like to no longer be a saver. And so he actually gets into that here. So Christine says, you just mentioned that trial running some aspects of retirement before you actually retire can be a great idea. But how can you actually do that? And Jamie says, I've talked to people about 5 years up leading to their retirement, and they've asked, should I learn how to do this? And he's talking about learning how to spend money. Should we actually take withdrawals from our accounts just so we understand what it feels like? Perhaps they're still putting money in, so they'd be in a situation where they'd be both contributing and withdrawing. That gives them the experience, but this gives them the experience of actually pulling money out of their IRA or 401k just to get into the habit of doing it. They'll learn that they have to pay taxes on those withdrawals and all those things that they just hadn't had experiences with before now. The more you can learn before you get there, the better. Now, I think that bit of advice is kind of out there, which is he's suggesting that, say you are over the age of 59 and a half and still working. His suggestion would be in the years that you're still earning an income where you might be contributing to your IRA, Roth IRA, or 401k, go ahead and get in the habit of withdrawing from those accounts just so you understand tax filing and how taxes are actually withheld or paid on withdrawals from those accounts. I don't necessarily know if going quite that far is required in order for you to get a sense of what it'll be like to withdraw money from those accounts. And if you're working with an advisor, that advice on how taxes are paid or how much you ought to withhold on those distributions, that's something that you can work out with them together. But I think that a better way to do this is something that he alluded to here is, he says, if you're not willing to essentially go that far, Jamie says, I've been very vocal on the strategy of stopping your saving as you near retirement. And this actually is going to have some interesting properties to it. And so one is if you get in the habit of stopping your saving, so say you just stop contributing to your 401k plan when you're very near retirement, say 2 or 3 years out from retirement, it's going to have a couple of effects. The first effect is it's going to get you used to no longer being a saver. And so if you're not saving money, there's really only a couple things you can do with it. You can give it away or you can spend it on yourself. There's only so many directions your money can go once it's flowed into the household. So if it's not going to go into savings or investing, you're going to spend it or you're going to give it away. So Jamie argues, how about in those last couple of years of work, you get used to essentially consuming 100% of your paycheck. And that's going to be anathema to a lot of people who have been frugal their entire careers. But his point is, it's going to get you in the habit of doing just that. Because we don't counsel our retirees when they're taking distributions from their IRAs to make sure they set a portion of that aside for future consumption. That's no longer what you're doing in retirement. In retirement, you're only withdrawing the money that you actually need to spend on yourself. Now, it could be expenses that you're not necessarily thrilled about, like taxes or, other sorts of consumer durables that are just part of the mundane realities of being alive. But 100% of the money you're withdrawing as a retiree is money that you are going to consume. It's no longer going to be saved and invested. However, the other side of it is, say you are nearing retirement, but it's not necessarily because your career is coming to its natural end, but maybe because you're starting to feel a little bit burned out. Jamie's point was, in order to alleviate some of that burnout, what if rather than being super diligent, saving every penny that you can save into your retirement accounts, you start spending more of that money and taking slightly longer vacations with your families, or spending a little bit more time away from the office, which can be costly in two ways. You got to pay for the vacations, and maybe you don't earn quite as much money because you're just not working as many hours at your job. But his point was, if you can cut back on the amount that you're working and spend a little bit more on yourself, maybe you actually stay employed a little bit longer. And so he had a really interesting point here where he says you might be able to work like 6 months more for if you are no longer on this really diligent work schedule and just putting every additional penny into your 401k plan. Maybe you can extend your runway at work 6 months or a year longer. And he says, all of a sudden, instead of saving an extra $20,000 for 2 years, which likely has very little impact on the longevity of your retirement portfolio, you might be able to work for 6 months more. And he says that is a lot more beneficial. This is the key to the strategy. Spend so we enjoy life and working so we can push off retirement a few more months or years. And so his point there is you actually do yourself a lot more good by delaying your retirement a little bit longer than you do by saving a little bit more in those years leading up to retirement. And I think his point there is that allows you to go a little bit longer without starting to draw down your assets. And that actually has far better long-term implications than just putting a little bit more away for retirement. And so Christine wants to dive into that a little bit more. And she says, you mentioned the limited impact of contributions later in life. So this would be contributions to your retirement accounts. That continuing to work is the greater good, certainly from a financial standpoint, when compared to making additional contributions. Can you expand on that? And Jamie says, that's especially true in the 3 to 5 years right before you retire, from age, say, 62 to 65. Those additional contributions that you're able to make are not making a meaningful impact, but you're probably cutting back on your quality of life substantially. Because that 10 or 20,000 that you're contributing is probably the difference between a really nice vacation for 10 days or no vacation at all. Spending the money at that life stage rather than saving more probably has more of an impact on your quality of life and enjoyment than saving it does on your retirement income sustainability. And he gets into the numbers here. He says research has shown that working 6 months longer, my goodness, is equivalent to saving about 1% extra of your pay for an additional 30 years. So with this strategy of not saving so much in those last years leading up to retirement, you're able to spend and enjoy your life and prepare for retirement, you actually end up in a better spot. And that runs counter to a lot of the traditional advice, which is to buckle down and get your house in order and then retire. And the note that I made here is I do find it quite interesting that they offer catch-up contributions on pretty much every kind of account. So now there's the super catch-up contribution for people who are between the ages of 60 and 63, not if you're 64 for whatever reason. Congress in their infinite wisdom would have to explain that one to you. But there's catch-up contributions to IRAs and Roth IRAs. There's catch-up contributions to your 401k and 403b. There are catch-up contributions to your HSA. But I thought that there should probably be get-ahead contributions where they actually allow younger people, if they have the financial latitude, to put more into these accounts so that they can better use the compound growth that only younger people can get on those assets that would then be invested for a much longer span of time. I find it interesting that we allow people who are very near their retirement to go ahead and load a little bit more money into these accounts. And I'm not saying that that's not worthwhile. It's certainly worthwhile if you hit your peak earnings years late. But I would feel like if you could allow younger people to put a little bit more into retirement accounts, we might start helping mitigate this retirement funding problem and this Social Security problem that we're certainly running up against in this country. But, I guess that's a conversation for another time. They move on. And Christine says, another thing we have to adjust to in the context of spending is actually using the assets in our portfolio. They are not an abstraction anymore. And I think that this is a it's a point that you think you might not need to make, is to tell people when they retire, hey, this big bucket of money that you've been saving for maybe at this point in time for 40 years, you're actually going to have to use it for your retirement. And it's not just on the goods and services that you're going to need. It's going to be on the things that you actually want to do. And this thought occurred to me as I was reading this, where it's like, we immediately understand how beneficial 401k plans, IRAs are, and Roth IRAs. So especially for a traditional account where you get a tax benefit on the front end, you don't pay taxes on that money. A lot of people think I've already accrued the benefits of this account because I put money into my 401k plan. I didn't have to pay taxes on it. You've got it half right. You only get the benefit of that money if you actually later distribute it from your account. So if you think about that somewhat logically, you can put, say, $20,000 into your 401k plan. It's a little bit more than that. You've deferred using that $20,000. You don't have the money. You've saved it for future you. And if you never actually withdraw that money and allow yourself to enjoy it, the tax benefit that you got on the front end is of no use to you, because the whole point was you haven't paid taxes on that money yet. And the idea would be, if you're a high earner, that you will withdraw it later and pay a lower tax rate on the money. That's where all the benefit is. And it's the same thing with the Roth, which is why Scott and I have been somewhat contrarian on the Roth conversion question, is because all of the benefit on the Roth is in the distribution. You don't actually benefit financially from a Roth IRA if you just have it. It's like having a self-licking ice cream cone. It's not doing anything for you if it's just sitting in the account, never to be distributed. Or if you really love your children, and I'm certain if you have them that you do, because I love mine, if you're fine funding a Roth IRA for them, then go ahead. But all of the benefit of your retirement assets that you've accumulated over the course of your career are only realized in the prudent distribution of those assets and their consumption. So I think they really dig into the matter here, where it's like you need to assign these assets a job. And so Jamie says that's why this notion of bucketing, so this is basically putting your money into separate tranches as you get toward retirement and in retirement, can be very helpful. When we move into retirement, we can assign a value and a purpose to assets. Our assets pre-retirement aren't actually that complicated. We have our investment portfolio, and all of the assets in it are for one singular purpose: to grow. And that growth is ultimately what you're going to use to fund your retirement. So stocks, bonds, target date funds, they're not there to provide income while we are working. But then we get into retirement and we use those assets differently. In fact, the purpose of our investment changes in retirement from diversification or risk mitigation, in some cases with bonds, to providing income or keeping up with inflation. For instance, our bond portfolio, our CDs, our stocks, they all have individual purposes. Bucketing or tranching these assets can help because it leans into mental accounting. So mental accounting is essentially not viewing your assets as an undifferentiated bucket of money, but rather looking at them and hiring them to do specific purposes, even though, of course, we all know money is general and fungible and transferable. It can do the same thing in different buckets. But if you lean into that mental account and say, I've got my near-term money, my mid-term money, my long-term money, I'm going to spend it for that purpose, it gives you the permission to go ahead and use those assets for that purpose. So he says, we see people do that in retirement. They're willing to spend certain types of money. They're more willing to spend certain types of money than others. For example, they're okay spending Social Security. They don't feel the same need to save every dollar because they feel that it's supposed to be this income spending source. And I would regard that as very true. Most people don't take their Social Security receipts and immediately invest them. They use it on their ordinary spending. With their investment portfolio, so this would be the money that they've actually accumulated for their retirement, they look at it and they say, I've saved that, so I'm supposed to keep saving it. Bucketing helps people get into the mindset of this bucket is for income needs. This one is held for legacy. This one is held for growth. That approach allows your mind to readjust and adapt to how these assets need to help you meet your goals. And so the note that I made was you need to hire your assets to do a specific job, because if you don't, you will probably be paralyzed by how it is that you're supposed to turn those accumulated assets into income in a way that doesn't jeopardize your long-term ability to remain retired. So the next topic they talk about is how your retirement income is very likely to fluctuate over the course of your retirement. And so this is a topic that we've discussed before, where when you have these various software programs that you use, you have to have some anchors. And one of those anchors, and this is one of the underlying assumptions that they're going to kind of debunk, even though Scott and I have, I feel like, debunked it quite often, is that your income is anchored to 4% of your portfolio at the outset, and then you're going to adjust it upward by inflation every year thereafter. Their point is virtually nobody actually spends money this way. And so Jamie says, when financial planners create a retirement income plan, it's usually this permanent looking printed document. And the planning process is really important, but the plan at that moment in time will change because retirement income planning is like trying to hit a moving target in the wind. Your target is specific to you. How much do you want to spend? What do you want to do? What's the legacy you want to leave? Those things create the size of the target that you plan to hit. That target is moving because we don't know how long we will be in retirement. This is one of the biggest challenges of retirement income planning. You could be there for 5 days or 35 years. What we have to do is plan around the certainty of today, but with the uncertainty of tomorrow in mind. And I think the real important point there is you want to have an annual review of your assets and your income. And by that, I mean, when we set up the 4% withdrawal rate, that is largely a safe withdrawal rate under this notion that you're going to adjust that income need upward by inflation every year and that you're going to be slowly but surely amortizing your portfolio over the course of a 25 to 35-year retirement. But if you have more money 5 years into when you've been retired, you don't need to keep spending the same amount of money you've been previously spending. In fact, you can probably spend considerably more money if you're so inclined because you have fewer and fewer years to finance because you're moving along the timeline toward the end of your life. And you also have a larger pool of assets from which you can draw that money. And people make this mistake all the time. They think, well, I'm beholden to this 4% rule because I've heard in the popular literature that that's the only safe way to get through a retirement. And it's like, well, it's a really good general rule of thumb when you're at the outset of a 25 to 35-year retirement. But again, if you're 5 or 10 years in and you have more money now than you did then, you are certainly safe to spend a little bit more money than that. Jamie goes on, he says, then there's the wind, which means that things are going to change. Things are going to change your plan almost immediately. Tax laws are going to change. Inflation is going to change. Macroeconomics, wars, pandemics, even what you want to accomplish, your health, your family's health, all of those things are going to change, and your plan needs to be able to adjust with them. That's why it's so important to build flexibility into retirement spending. And that's definitely something Scott and I have touched on. A lot of people had estate plans that left a big traditional IRA to their heirs because their heirs could distribute that IRA over their life expectancy, which made them very tax efficient for inheriting children. That is no longer the case. The Secure 2 Act, which was passed, right after COVID, essentially eliminated the stretch IRA provision for non-designated eligible beneficiaries. That's a mouthful. That's just to say, in a faster way, your children. They're going to have that 10-year rule, and many of them are not only going to have the 10-year rule, but they're going to have annual mandatories. All of that to say, traditional IRAs are no longer a great estate planning vehicle. So their point is you need to be highly adaptable to the changes that Congress are going to throw at us. Jamie goes on, and we talk about the fundamental assumption about spending, and he says, people don't just take whatever money they had this year and adjust it for inflation next year and spend it. Your expenditures just don't adjust like that. Taxes don't perfectly adjust like that. Healthcare doesn't perfectly adjust like that. Housing costs don't perfectly adjust like that. For most retirees, actually, housing costs remain their single largest expenditure. But for homeowners, they've locked in the majority of their housing costs, and those costs are not increasing with inflation. And this is definitely something that we see with our clients, which is their core expenses are not that inflation sensitive. I'm highly inflation sensitive right now because I essentially have, as we joked about on the last podcast, an irreparable trade deficit with Costco. So I go there all the time. I'm very sensitive to changes in groceries. And as we know, anybody who's out there in the real world, grocery prices have been quite high for many, many reasons. So I'm very sensitive to that. But retired individuals who have generally their kids have left the home and most of their costs are fixed, their mortgage is fixed. Yes, real estate prices can fluctuate, so their taxes that they pay might go up. Insurance costs on their house as the house's value continues to rise, that might go up. But most of their core expenses are somewhat predictable and not that sensitive to inflation, which is why this whole notion of you're going to spend 4% out of the first year and adjust it by exactly the amount of CPI every single year, it's just not really borne out in the data that we have with retirees. And I think Jamie did a great job of just saying, you're going to have to be a lot more flexible in your spending than this very rigid, academic construct of whatever inflation is that dictates what you're going to spend the next year. Jamie goes on. He says, retirement income planning should be adjustment based. When markets drop or your health isn't as good, you adjust to that. If inflation is higher, we know that people tend to adjust how they spend. That's the point of inflation to some degree. It's going to change spending behaviors. But a lot of times we model it so that when inflation goes up, you'll just keep spending in the same way. And this, for our practice, was made particularly salient during 2020 and 2022. So obviously, if you retired just ahead of COVID, you were in for a real, I would say, unfortunate situation because we just really weren't clear on how the world was going to recover from lockdown, as an example. And not to mention, we had a very sharp decline in equity prices. So being a new retiree in 2020 was a very difficult period, but spending patterns changed dramatically. And that wasn't just because people couldn't travel, though that was certainly part of it, but it was also because people realized, hey, we might want to be a little bit more cautious with our consumption here because the economy has kind of come to a screeching halt as a consequence of this virus, and we're not exactly clear on how long the recovery might take. So what we saw from our practice, and we got some relief from the government, you didn't have to take a mandatory distribution that year, as an example. People adapted their spending to the economic realities that they were faced with. And while that can be uncomfortable at times, it's a far more realistic assumption of what it is that you, the listener, are going to do in your retirement than just, again, this theoretical construct of you're going to spend 4% and you're going to adjust it up for inflation. So Jamie goes on, he says, that gets us into a much more interesting conversation because it's more about enjoyment and lifestyle. Everyone, no matter how wealthy they are, make trade-offs around money. We don't spend enough time discussing how that affects retirement, even though it's a big part of retirees' lives. They decide to go to dinner at 5 p.m. because it's cheaper than going at 7, and they can probably get the same amount of enjoyment out of it by making those small adjustments. Most retirement income plans facing a shortfall can be fixed by making small adjustments over time to the plan. And so his point here being is if the spending that you are currently doing might put you in jeopardy of running out of money, it's not like you need to overhaul your entire existence. There are probably some very small adjustments you can make to the rudder, as Mo was talking about in a previous podcast, that will put you on an entirely different trajectory. And again, those do not have to be austerity measures. You can probably still live a perfectly wonderful retirement if you are willing to make some small changes to the way that you spend money, and those small changes will add up over the course of a 30-year period. Okay. This is something that you guys will have heard from me many times. You might be getting a little bit tired of it by now, but we're going to get into it again because I think it's important. Christine asked this question. I think she posed this question to basically everybody she had interviewed in this book. She says, what about the role of guaranteed income sources? So this would be something like an annuity. It seems like putting into place a more guaranteed income could make it easier to be flexible, somewhat paradoxically, with portfolio withdrawals. And Jamie says, enlarging guaranteed sources of income, for example, by delaying Social Security or purchasing an annuity is important for a number of reasons. One is that it reduces the volatility of potential outcomes. So essentially, this narrows the band of how your retirement might go. It makes your year over year results on your investment portfolio slightly less varied than if you had taken 100% market risk with the totality of your assets. So that's what he's saying there when he says it's going to reduce the volatility of potential outcomes. Putting some of your assets toward more guaranteed income allows you to exclude some of the really bad and really good scenarios. What does he mean by that? It means based on the sequence with which you get your returns, you might leave in a state of, say, something like $15 million. Retirement planning software would say, congratulations, that's a wonderful outcome. I certainly have some questions about whether or not that actually means you had a wonderful retirement. But in the hypothetical world of just software, it says, wow, you did so great. You left in a state of 15 million. However, in the same analysis with the same number of assets, same spending needs, same time period, you might run out of money 15 years into your retirement. And you might be wondering, how is it that the same asset base with the same income needs could have such disparate outcomes? And that's largely because of the various ways in which the market might give you or deliver your return sequence. And if you get really negative events early, that can impair your portfolio's ability to sustain your retirement. So what Jamie is saying here is, if you're willing to take that $15 million estate option off the table, say, yes, if you turn some of your money over to an insurance company, you're not going to leave quite as large an estate. But what if it raises the floor? What if it means that your worst case scenario isn't that you ran out of money 13 years into retirement, but maybe in the very worst case, you ran out of money 25 years into retirement, or maybe you're already beyond life expectancy? His point would be almost all retirees are willing to make that trade. And the reason that they're willing to make that trade is for most retirees, more money isn't going to materially change their lifestyle. You're pretty well embedded in your personality. This happened. I think I was born at 65, but you're pretty well embedded in your personality when you retire. And so his point is, if you all of a sudden got really wonderful results on your investment portfolio, you're probably not going to adapt an entirely different, much more luxurious lifestyle as a consequence of that. However, you will feel an overwhelming sense of anxiety if your portfolio has a chance of running out of money just 10 years into your retirement. Nobody wants to retire under those conditions. It's very difficult to enjoy yourself if that's your reality. So what he's saying is we should be willing to trade some upside if it means we raise up the floor, or if it means we eliminate some of those worst case scenario outcomes. He goes on, he says, knowing that your baseline needs will be met means you may allow yourself to actually spend more. Again, this is sort of the annuity paradox. Having more guaranteed income can give you permission to be more aggressive with your remaining portfolio, to grow it over the course of a 30-year investment period. Some people don't feel comfortable being in the market in retirement because of volatility, which makes sense. But if you take some of that concern off the table by increasing your guaranteed income, you can potentially invest in a higher return portfolio that increases the likelihood that your assets will last. Having more guaranteed income also allows you to be more flexible with your other assets. Some people will say they don't want to tie up their liquid assets in guaranteed income sources. And this was, I thought, was an extremely good point. But the reality is, if you have to hold your portfolio to provide the future income, you don't really have liquidity. You are just holding those future income streams to the side. What he means by that is, a lot of the argument against buying an annuity with a chunk of your retirement assets is that you lose control over the principal value. So yes, you exchange principal in return just a plain vanilla annuity. You can do what's called a single payment immediate annuity, where you turn over a big chunk of money to an insurance company and they immediately turn that on to a lifetime income stream. Okay. That would suggest, and a lot of people have qualms with this, well, now I no longer have access to the capital that I turned over to the insurance company. And Jamie's point here is that's true, but you weren't treating that money as if you had access to it in any case. You were holding a bunch of that money off for spending that you might have to do later. That $1 million or $100,000 or however much you turned over to the insurance company, that wasn't money that you were intending on spending on 60-year-old you anyway. That was some money for 65-year-old you and 70 and 75 and 80 and 85. And his point was, by turning it over to the insurance company, you can de-risk the income stream because the insurance company is taking on that risk. And now, rather than having to hold this money to the side and take market risk with it so that you can turn it into income when you are 85, the insurance company is going to take care of that for you. And I thought that point was extremely good because he's saying, okay, rather than turning this money over to the insurance company, you can hang on to it and agonize about whether or not you're spending too much or too little of it, how it should be invested, how much income you might be able to take off of it, when it is that you're going to take the income off of it. He's saying, why do that? Why put yourself through that? Why not just turn some of it over so that you know your baseline income needs are being met and those are insured? And I think I just thought it was a really wonderful way of putting that. So he says, putting some guaranteed income streams into place can allow you to take some of that other money and spend it more dynamically over the course of retirement because it's not all set aside to provide income at age 85. So that's this point, is if you have a guaranteed income stream that you know is going to be meeting some of your needs, rather than waiting to withdraw some of the money that you could have spent until you're 85 because you feared that you might run out, he's saying this might actually give you permission to spend more of it now on the things that you want to spend it when you can most enjoy it, which would be when you're actually healthy enough to enjoy it, as opposed to agonizing over it and just waiting until you're 85. The last sort of thing that they get into is how your sources of income are going to change. So this is the point where we get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of optimizing how you would withdraw from the various accounts that you'll have at your disposal in retirement. And his point is, their point was, you're going to have Social Security, you might have a pension, you might have a taxable brokerage account, you might have a traditional IRA or 401k, and you might have a Roth account, and you might have an HSA. I assure you I'm not going to nerd out quite as much on HSAs today as I did in the previous episode, but please do listen to that episode because you should be funding your HSA if you have access to one. And so basically what they said was, you shouldn't get married to any specific sort of liquidation strategy, because various things that happen over time that are outside of your control are going to dictate some of the costs of withdrawing from these various accounts. So what I mean by that, if you're lucky enough to retire at age 60, as an example, so you're well ahead of when you're going to take Social Security. So even if you take it early at 62, but say you're going to wait until age 70, not a recommendation, just hypothetical, you have this 10-year period where you can exercise a very high degree of tax control. So between 60 and 70, there are no other sources of taxable income aside from what like dividends and interest you might be earning on some of your taxable brokerage account assets. And if you don't have a pension in this case, which means that you can probably drive your effective tax rate down to the lowest it's been for years and years and years. Because if you can turn assets that have appreciated into income, utilizing capital gains rates, those top out at the very highest end at 23.8%. And virtually nobody is paying 23.8%. It's very likely that you'll pay a considerable portion of that at 0 and the remainder of that at 15. So it's not unheard of for us to see retirees in that stage of their life, that kind of first 10-year period, having effective tax rates in the single digits or the low double digits. So like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12% effective tax rates. And you can exercise a high degree of control there. That is the window where, if you are very interested in doing Roth conversions, you can do so without some of the kind of downstream second order effects. So those would be those income related monthly adjustment amounts that you might pay on your Medicare Part B and D premiums, as an example. Now, there is a 2-year look back. So if you do a big Roth conversion when you're 63 and file for Medicare at 65, they are going to use that. But that's what they're saying. So you might set up a strategy for income distribution over that 10-year period, but that might not be the best strategy when you do file for Social Security and then when you do ultimately have required minimum distributions. So there's going to be an arc of the way that your assets and your income streams need to evolve as these essentially events roll off. So you file for Social Security, you immediately have more ordinary income. You hit required minimum distribution age, you're going to have a lot more ordinary income. Things like Roth conversion probably don't make sense anymore. And then, as Mo talked about on a previous episode, maybe it does make sense to make a big distribution from a Roth if you're going to fund something like a long-term care policy. But the ordinary course of things would say, leave those assets in the Roth for as long as possible, because the benefit is in that accumulation of tax-free growth. But as I just alluded to previously, the real benefit is when somebody actually gets to take that money out without paying any income taxes on it. So they're saying your income sources in retirement, which is where you're essentially getting the money from your portfolio, that's going to change based on where your tax sort of bracket is and what other sources of incomes that you have. And so his point here is, you really want to be working with somebody who's familiar with these things so that you just don't make any big tax mistakes by withdrawing too much or too little from one of these locations as to where your assets are. And then they wrap it up with how you might define success in retirement. And so Jamie says, in financial planning, we usually define retirement income success as your portfolio and income meeting your desired level of spending or expenses throughout your projected lifespan. A really long-winded way of saying you didn't run out of money. That makes retirement very binary. You're either going to succeed, you got to spend every dollar that you wanted to spend, or you're going to fail. And that's just not really how we live life. Retirement shouldn't be success or failure. It's going to be all over the place. Americans don't fail at retirement. We adjust. We're going to have good days and bad days. We're going to have good periods and bad periods. We live our whole lives adjusting. Retirement is like budgeting. If we start running out of money or getting past our budget, we don't just keep spending. The way we usually discuss retirement income isn't how people live. It's based on models and to some degree the limitations of technology. And that's what we got into. The anchors that the model requires are somewhat unrealistic, but it is required that we have them there so that they can give us something to go on. So most people don't define the success or failure of their lives in this way. If you fell $10 short at the end of your retirement, but you got to live the happiest life you could have imagined, Would you really call that a failure? Of course not. I think most people would be really happy with that outcome. But mathematically, your portfolio strategy failed because you fell $10 short a day early. Meanwhile, a success is you ended up with 50 million at the end and you didn't spend any of it. But the reality is ending up with 50 million and not spending any of it down and not getting to do anything you wanted is probably a failed retirement. And I would agree with that. It's saying I think that we can go too far down that road and saying that evidence of a failed retirement would be a large estate. But I think part of that could be the reason that this person has a large estate is because returns over their retirement were higher than they anticipated, and they actually got to spend every dollar they wanted to spend, and they couldn't really control the degree to which their assets just happened to grow, but they were perfectly happy. So I don't think it's great evidence of failure if you run out of money a day early. Like they said, if you run out of money 10 years early, big problem. But if you run out of money one day early, not a huge problem. But I also wouldn't say that it's a failure if you leave a large estate, because maybe you do want to pass some money on to your kids, or maybe you really did lead the retirement lifestyle you wanted to lead, and you were very comforted by the fact that you were never at risk of running out of money. That can actually allow people to live the lives they want to live because they can do so in the full faith and confidence that they've got the financial backing to keep going about doing what they want to do. And that would be really what being wealthy would be like, is all of your lifestyles is totally financeable, and there's maybe just a little bit left over. Christine says, how do we know that someone dying with so she gets into how do we know that someone dying with a big pot of money is a bad outcome, though? Some people might hear about leaving a big legacy and think that's okay. It's exactly the point that I just got into. And so Jamie goes on, and he certainly agrees, but he says, but a lot of people end up with money in the end because they gave up on their goals or aspirations. They didn't want to spend because they were fearful of running out of money, and they were fearful of how long they might live, or if they didn't have funds set aside specifically for long-term care. And this brings us back to the conversation that we had with Mo about the two real benefits of long-term care. Principally is you're covered in the event that you need it. But I think secondarily is it gives you that permission to spend down the rest of your assets more dynamically, like Jamie has talked about, on the things that you actually want to do, because you've taken that risk in your mind off the table. And I think our brains are somewhat blunt tools. And so we know that we don't want to run out of money. And I was actually just telling Hannah off air about this experiment they did where they put people in a room and they wanted to examine stress hormones as a response to a threat of being shocked. And so they told some of the people that you had a 100% chance of receiving an electric shock, 50% chance, 25% chance, 5% chance, 10% chance, whatever it was. Their thesis was, as the probability of an electric shock being delivered declined, so too should the stress response. So they should have less adrenaline, less cortisol, they should sweat less, their heart rate should go up less, their blood pressure should go up less, all of that. That was their thesis, and they were wrong. What they discovered was it wasn't until the risk of a shock went to zero that people stopped having the stress response. And I think a lot of people regard their money in exactly the same way. If they feel as though there is an event out there in the distant fog of the future that might push them over the edge of their retirement funding. Say there's this big healthcare event. A member of their family gets very ill. They themselves get very ill. Your mind is not going to weigh those probabilities against that expected outcome and put a fine dollar amount on exactly how much you should worry about that. You're probably going to worry way too much or not at all about it. And the only way to worry not at all about it is if you feel adequately insured against those low probability but high severity events. This is not a recommendation to try and insure your life against all such events of that variety. You can't do it. You would eat up all of your assets in there. But those ones that you are most worried about, just have the conversation of taking that risk off the table. If there's a way to get a good long-term care policy in place and that allows you to live the life that you want to live, well, then why would you not do that? And it's the same with the annuity thing. I'm not recommending that you go out and buy an annuity. I'm just saying if you are going to feel better about spending the money that you work so diligently for your entire career and give it and allow yourself to enjoy it in your retirement, if an annuity will help you do that, probably worth investigating. So, Christine says, it seems like it would be important for people to define success at the outset of retirement. And I think that's very, very true. Scott had previously said to yourself, you should be true, or to thyself be true. If you understand what success looks like in retirement before you go out, if you have an aim and a vision for your life as you enter this stage of your life, you're going to have a much better chance of actually achieving that aim than if you go in there thinking, I'm just going to figure it out as I go along. Jamie would say, Christine would say, I would say, that's not a good plan. And I think just as a final note, it's really easy to be overwhelmed by retirement. There are all of these decisions that you're going to have to make. There are all these things that you're going to have to do. And you only get one shot at it. It's not like you get to live your retirement twice. You're going to move along in your life. The time is going to pass no matter what it is that you do. And so I can get a sense that that's going to be overwhelming. I feel overwhelmed often in my life. I have 7 children. The listeners to this podcast know that. And so I often get hung up on, am I being the best dad I can be to all my children who have very disparate needs? And so it can be overwhelming. How many activities should they be doing? Should they go to public school? Should they go to private school? Should they go to homeschool? Should they learn how to play chess? Should they learn how to play sports? How dangerous is lacrosse? How dangerous is football? What are the kinds of things that they should be doing? How soon should they learn how to swim? All of that is extremely challenging for any parent out there. But what I found is if I just distill this down to a simple razor, what can I do to love my children? What came to me was, and this won't be true of everybody, if I love their mom, I will be a good dad. So if I love their mom and treat mom right, and I can demonstrate to all of my kids how a woman should be treated and how a man ought to treat a woman, I think I'm going to get like 90% of the benefits. And everything else is just going to be icing on the cake. So if you are in a situation where you are entering retirement and you feel overwhelmed, if you are married, get with your spouse, get an index card, and write down 3 to 5 non-negotiable things that you want to have happen in your retirement. And these are going to be personal to you. So set aside all the various interesting and difficult decisions that you might need to make and all of the worry about running out of money, and just actually write down the things that you really want to have happen in your retirement. Simplify it as much as you can. For me, be a good dad, love my kid's mom. For you, having a great retirement, 3 to 5 things, and let everything else take care of itself. Hopefully working with a professional, could be an accountant, could be a financial planner, could be a lawyer, probably going to be some of all 3 of those. But distill it down as much as you can to those things that you're non-negotiable on, and I think that you're going to set yourself up for a very successful retirement.
This book club series is based on the book How to Retire: 20 Lessons for a Happy, Successful, and Wealthy Retirement by Christine Benz, published in 2024. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Personal Finance Project. This show would not exist without the help of our brilliant creative director, Kira Minifield. Kira, thank you for everything you do to keep this show running. On to the disclosures. This broadcast contains the current opinions of the hosts and are subject to change. The broadcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice or recommendations. Investors should obtain professional advice before making investment decisions. This is not a complete analysis of every material fact regarding any company, industry, or security. The information has been obtained from sources we consider to be reliable but cannot guarantee their accuracy. Robert W. Baird & Co. Incorporated is not a legal or tax services provider, and you are strongly encouraged to seek the advice of the appropriate professional advisors before taking any action. For more information about any companies discussed, please contact Baird. Past performance is not indicative of future results, and diversification does not ensure a profit or protect against loss. All investments carry some level of risk, including loss of principal. An investment cannot be made directly in an index. Investors should consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses of a fund carefully before investing. This and other information is found in the prospectus and summary prospectus. For a prospectus, please contact your financial professional and read it carefully before investing. Annuities carry unique risks, including market risk, investment risk, and claims-paying abilities of the insurer. There may also be instances where a contract will pay out less than the premiums paid or expire within the lifetime of the insured. There may be penalties for early withdrawal, and they are not insured by the FDIC because they are insurance, not an investment. Investors should consider carefully information contained in the prospectus or, if available, the summary prospectus, including investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. You can request a prospectus by reaching out to your financial advisor. Please read the prospectus carefully before investing. Investment returns will fluctuate and are subject to market volatility, so that an investor's shares, when redeemed or sold, may be worth more or less than their original cost. Unlike mutual funds, shares of ETFs are not individually redeemable directly with the ETF. Shares of ETFs are bought and sold at market price, which may be higher or lower than the net asset value. This broadcast may not be reproduced without express permission of Robert W. Baird & Co. Incorporated.